Welcome, dear listener. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Not because I need you to be, but because your presence, even in silence, makes this story feel less like a memory and more like a shared breath. So wherever you are curled beneath a quilt that still holds the warmth of your day, stretched out on a couch with the last light of the moon tracing patterns on the wall, or perhaps sitting quietly in a room where the only sound is the soft ticking of a clock that's forgotten what time it is, invite you to let go. Let go of the need to remember, to analyze, to hold on. This isn't a lesson. It's a lullaby woven from history. Take a slow breath in and let it out even slower. Feel the weight of your body sink into the surface beneath you, as if the earth itself is whispering. You can rest now. Close your eyes if you'd like, or keep them open, gazing softly at nothing in particular. Either way, allow your mind to soften at the edges, like ink spreading gently through water. Tonight, we're going to travel not with urgency, not with maps or compasses, but with the quiet certainty of someone who knows that every great story begins not with a shout, but with a sigh. And the story we'll follow tonight begins in a place so still, so high above the valleys where most people lived, that time itself seemed to move differently there. It begins in the Alps, those ancient mountains that rise like the spine of Europe. Cloaked in mist for much of the year, their peaks dusted with snow, even in the gentlest summers, and nestled somewhere among those ridges. Hidden from the eyes of kings and merchants alike, stood a small stone fortress, not grand, not golden, just solid, enduring. Its name was Habichtsburg Hawk's Castle, and from that watchful perch, a family would begin a journey that would one day stretch from the icy shores of the North Sea to the sun-baked courtyards of Andalusia, from the echoing halls of Vienna to the distant shores of the New World. But we won't rush to those places, not yet, because the true magic of this story isn't in the crowns they wore or the lands they claimed. It's in the quiet choices made in candlelit rooms, in the way a mother might whisper a name to her child before tucking them in at night, in the rustle of a marriage contract sealed not with fanfare, but with a single drop of red wax, in the patience of a lineage that understood. Empires aren't built in a day. They're stitched together, thread by thread, over generations, often by people who never lived to see the full tapestry. The Habsburgs didn't storm onto the stage of history with trumpets and banners. They entered through a side door, almost unnoticed, carrying nothing but a name, a patch of land, and a stubborn belief that stability, true, lasting peace was worth more than glory. And somehow, over centuries, that belief would echo through palaces, parliaments, and battlefields, shaping the destiny of half a continent. You don't need to know who they were before tonight. You don't need to recall which emperor ruled when, or which treaty ended which war. None of that matters here. What matters is the feeling, the texture of their world, the chill of stone floors in winter, the scent of beeswax and old parchment, the sound of Latin prayers drifting from a chapel at dawn, the weight of a ring passed from father to son, not as a symbol of power, but as a promise. I will not let this fall. And if you'd like, as we begin this journey together, you can leave a quiet thought in the space between us, your name, the place you're listening from, or simply the emotion that brought you here tonight. Maybe it's curiosity, maybe it's exhaustion. Maybe it's just the gentle pull of a story that feels like it's been waiting for you. Whatever it is, it's welcome here. Because history at its best isn't a record of what happened. It's a mirror held up in the dark, showing us how others lived, loved, doubted, and dreamed so we might feel a little less alone in our own quiet hours. So let the noise of the present fade now. Let the hum of your phone, the creak of the floorboards, the distant sound of traffic, all of it drift away like leaves on a slow-moving river. And come with me, not to a classroom, not to a battlefield, but to a hill in the Swiss Alps, where the wind carries secrets older than nations, and where, long ago, a family began to dream in whispers. Before there were empires stitched together by marriage contracts and sealed with wax the color of dried blood, before the double-headed eagle came to symbolize a dominion that stretched from the sun-drenched shores of the Mediterranean to the frozen forests of the Baltic, there was only the earth-raw patient. and indifferent tanned on that earth, people lived as close to the rhythm of nature as roots are to soil. In the Europe of the 10th century, time did not march forward in neat lines drawn by historians, but pooled in the hollows of valleys, gathered in the rings of ancient oaks, and drifted like mist through forests so dense that sound itself seemed to dissolve before it could travel far. There were no nations yet, only lands held together by loyalty, kinship, and the quiet understanding that survival depended not on glory, but on steadiness. A man's worth was measured not by how much he conquered, but by how well he kept his word, how faithfully he tended his fields, and how gently he spoke to his children before sleep. Life moved slowly here, shaped by the turning of the seasons rather than the tick of a clock. And in that slowness, something profound took root, the belief that to endure was itself a kind of greatness. High in the heart of what we now call Switzerland, where the land begins to rise toward the sky and the air grows thin and sharp with the scent of pine and cold stone, the Alps stood not as a backdrop but as a presence, an ancient watchful force that shaped everything it touched. These mountains were not yet admired for their beauty or crossed for sport. They were respected as thresholds, as places where the ordinary rules of human life bent and blurred under the weight of altitude and silence. Their slopes were steep and unforgiving, carved by glaciers long vanished. Their valleys so narrow that sunlight arrived late in the morning and left early in the afternoon, casting long shadows that seemed to hold secrets older than memory. Streams tumbled down from icy heights with a sound like distant bells, feeding meadows where wildflowers bloomed in spring and snow lingered in patches well into summer. The forests here were thick with fir and spruce, their branches heavy with moisture, their trunks dark and slick with moss, and the air always carried the faint metallic tang of distant rain. It was a world that asked for humility, for patience, for a willingness to listen more than to speak. And those who lived here learned early that the mountains gave nothing freely but to those who stayed. Who watched, who waited, they offered something rarer than gold: permanence. And on one of those ridges just high enough to see the smoke of distant farms curling into the evening sky, just low enough to draw fresh water from a spring that never ran, a small fortress had been built from the very bones of the mountain. Its stones were rough-hewn, pulled from the earth, and stacked without mortar in the earliest days. Later, reinforced with lime and care, each block chosen not for beauty, but for endurance. The walls were thick enough to withstand the fiercest winter gales and the occasional raid from restless neighbors. The windows narrow slits that let in light but kept out arrows and snow, and the roof pitched steeply so that heavy snows would slide off before they could collapse the beams. This was Habichtsburg Hawk's castle, not because it soared like a bird, but because it watched, unblinking, over the lands below, its presence a quiet promise of stability in a world that knew little of it. What? No banners flew from its towers, no trumpets announced the hour. Only the wind moved through its courtyards, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant rain, and the occasional cry of a raven circling above, as if even the birds knew this place was meant to last. Inside those walls, life unfolded with the unhurried rhythm of a heartbeat. The lord of the castle, Radbot, was not a warrior in the grand sense, but a steward of the land, a man whose hands were calloused from walking the boundaries of his holdings, whose voice was calm in disputes over grazing rights or water access, and whose greatest pride was not in conquest but in continuity. He rose with the sun, checked on the livestock, walked the fields with his bailiff, and returned at dusk to sit by the fire with his wife, Ida, and their children. Ida, daughter of a noble family from Lotharingia, managed the household with a quiet authority that needed no proclamation. She oversaw the baking of bread in the stone oven, the brewing of ale from barley grown in their own fields, the weaving of linen from flax spun by the women of the household, and the care of the sick with herbs gathered from the mountainside: chamomile for sleep, yarrow for wounds, elderflower for fever. Their home was not luxurious. It had no tapestries from the east, no silver goblets, no painted ceilings, but it was whole, warm, and filled with the steady hum of purposeful life, the kind of life that does not seek to be remembered, but simply to be lived well. The great hall, though modest in size, was the heart of the fortress, a space where warmth and community gathered like smoke rising toward the rafters. A central hearth burned day and night, its flames, fed by logs split from fallen trees, its heat radiating through the stone floor and up into the bones of those who sat nearby. Benches lined the walls, worn smooth by years of use, and a long table stood in the center, scarred by knives and stained by wine, yet sturdy enough to hold generations of shared meals. At night, the family and their closest retainers would gather here, not for feasts, but for simple suppers of stew, bread, and cheese, followed by stories some old, some new told in low voices that blended with the crackle of the fire. There was no music unless a traveling minstrel happened to pass through, and even then, the songs were slow and mournful, meant to soothe the soul rather than stir the blood. Silence was not empty here. It was full of presence, of listening, of the unspoken understanding that everyone belonged, not because of rank, but because they had chosen to stay, to share the same fire, the same winter, the same hope for spring. Outside the walls, the world moved at the pace of oxen and seasons. Farmers rose before dawn to feed their animals, worked the fields until dusk, and spent the long winter nights mending tools, spinning wool, and telling stories by firelight. Shepherds led their flocks to high pastures in summer, returning in autumn with wool, cheese, and tales of wolves seen but not fought. Traders passed through occasionally, their carts laden with salt from the mines, iron tools from distant forges, and news from courts far away, rumors of new bishops in Germany, of wars in Italy, of strange ships seen off the coast of Gaul, but such news rarely changed anything in the high valleys. Here change came slowly, if at all, and stability was the highest virtue. A man's word was his bond, sealed not with ink but with a handshake and a shared cup of wine, and broken promises were remembered longer than victories. Children learned early that trust was more valuable than coin, and that a name spoken with respect was worth more than a chest full of silver. Authority in this world was not abstract but intimate. A farmer obeyed his lord not because of a decree from a distant emperor, but because that lord had shared his grain, during a failed harvest, had stood beside him when his barn burned, or had spoken kindly to his daughter at the village well. Oaths were made face to face, in the open air, or by the hearth, and carried the weight of ancestry and honor. Names mattered more than titles. Radbot of Habichtsburg, Ita of Lotharingiand. Those names were tied to land, to action, to memory. To be known was to be trusted, and to be trusted was to hold a kind of power far deeper than any crown could confer. There were no courts here, only conversations. No laws written in stone, only understandings passed down like heirlooms, worn smooth by use and time. The church was present but not dominant. A small chapel stood near the castle, its bell ringing softly at dawn, noon, and dusk, its walls whitewashed, and its altar simple. A priest came once a month to say Mass, hear confessions, and bless the fields. But most spiritual life happened at home, in whispered prayers before sleep, in candles lit for the dead, in the sign of the cross made over a newborn's brow. Faith was not a spectacle, but a companion. As constant and unobtrusive as the mountains themselves, woven into the fabric of daily life like thread in a well-worn cloak, people did not pray for glory. They prayed for rain, for health, for safe passage through the winter, and for the strength to carry on. Their faith was practical, humble, and deeply rooted in the earth they walked upon. There was no sense of destiny in this place, no feeling that history was being made. Radbot did not dream of empires. He dreamed of seeing his children grow strong, of his cattle surviving the winter, of his name being spoken with respect long after he was gone. Ita did not imagine her descendants wearing crowns. She imagined them safe, fed, and rooted in the same soil that had nourished her. Their ambitions were small, their hopes quiet. In that quietness lay a kind of strength, the strength of continuity, of presence, of simply being where you are meant to be, without needing to prove anything to anyone. They did not know they were planting a seed that would one day grow into an empire. They only knew that today the fire must be kept lit, the well must be clear, and the children must be tucked in before the cold deepened. And yet, in this very ordinariness, something extraordinary was taking root. Not in the form of a prophecy or a vision, but in the slow accumulation of trust, of land, of alliances woven through marriage and mutual need. The Habsburgs were not born to power. They grew into it, Like an oak grows from an acorn knot with a burst of energy, but with patient, relentless reaching toward the light. Their rise would be measured not in battles won, but in marriages made, not in lands seized, but in inheritances accepted, not in noise, but in silence. Every handshake, every shared meal, every quiet promise kept added another stone to the foundation of what would one day become the most enduring dynasty in European history. You can almost feel it now, the roughness of the stone walls under your palm, the scent of wood smoke and damp wool in the air, the way the cold seeps through your boots as you stand on the ramparts at dawn, watching mist rise from the valley below. This is the world that made the Habsburgs possible, a world of limits, of closeness, of deep roots. It is a world that asks you to slow down, to listen, to notice the small things that over time become the foundation of something vast. Here in this stone nest among the clouds on a ridge where the wind never stops whispering, a family lived without knowing they were the beginning of a story that would one day stretch across continents. They simply lived in living with care, with steadiness, with quiet dignity. They planted a seed that would grow taller than any mountain. Its branches one day shading palaces from Madrid to Vienna, its roots still anchored in the same Alpine soil where it all began, where the hawk still circles and the wind still carries the memory of their name. In the hushed world of the high valleys, where time moved like mist curling through pine branches and silence was not empty, but full of listening. Change did not arrive with drums or proclamations. It seeped in like morning fog. Soft and unnoticed at first, until one day you realized the air itself had shifted. It was not a revolution, not even a decision made in haste, but something quieter. The slow turning of a name from a local reference into a word that carried weight beyond the ridge. Where once Radbot of Habichtsburg had been spoken only by shepherds who borrowed his pasture, or millers who paid him a share of their grain. Now that name began to appear in letters sealed with unfamiliar wax, in conversations between bishops and constants, in the quiet calculations of merchants who knew that stability was rarer than silver and just as valuable. This was not fame, not yet, but it was the first breath of something larger. A whisper that would one day become a wind strong enough to carry a dynasty across continents. Radbot himself was a man shaped by stone and season, his presence as steady and unassuming as the fortress he called home. He stood neither tall nor imposing, but there was a calm in his bearing that made others lean toward him in moments of uncertainty, as if his silence held answers they could not yet voice. His hands were rough from work, not the work of war, but of stewardship, mending fences after spring storms, checking the depth of the well before winter, walking the boundaries of his land with a pace that suggested he was not measuring territory, but remembering it. He spoke little in gatherings, but when he did, his words were measured, practical, and always followed by action. He did not believe in promises made in the heat of the moment. He believed in commitments kept in the cold light of dawn, year after year, and in an age when oaths were broken as easily as twigs. That kind of reliability became a kind of power, quiet, deep, and enduring. His thoughts were not filled with visions of crowns or conquests, but with the texture of daily life, the way the barley bent under autumn rain, the sound of his children's laughter echoing in the courtyard, the warmth of the hearth after a long day in the fields. He dreamed not of glory, but of continuity, of seeing his sons grow into men who would hold the land with the same care he had learned from his father, of ensuring that the spring never ran dry, that the roof never leaked in a storm, that the name Habichtsburg remained a place people could trust. This was his ambition, if it could be called that. Not to rise above others, but to stand firm among them, a stone in the riverbed, while the waters of chaos rushed past. And it was precisely this refusal to chase spectacle that made others begin to look to him when the world around them grew unsteady. Ida, his wife, was his equal in this quiet strength, though her power moved in different currents. Born into the noble house of Lotharingia, she had not come to Habichtsburg as a passive bride, but as a partner in every sense, a woman whose mind was as sharp as her needle, whose memory held the names of every family that had ever shared their table, and whose hands could soothe a fever with herbs gathered at dawn. She managed the household not as a domain to be ruled, but as a living organism to be nurtured. The bread was baked at the right hour. The wool was spun with care, the sick were tended with patience, and the children were taught not only prayers, but the value of a kept promise. She understood that a home was the first kingdom, and that its strength lay not in walls, but in the bonds woven within them. Together, she and Radbot created a space where steadiness was not just practice, but honored, a place where a name could begin to mean something beyond a patch of land. And then came the first true tremor in their quiet world, the death of the last Count of Keyburg, without a male heir. This was not a distant event, like news of a war in Italy or a new pope in Rome. It was a shift in the very ground beneath their feet. The Keyburg lands bordered their own, their people intermarried, their streams shared the same valleys. For generations, the two houses had existed in a delicate dance of alliance and rivalry. But now that dance had ended and the music had stopped, the question that rippled through the region was not who would fight for Keyburg, but who would be entrusted with it. In a time when inheritance often led to bloodshed, Radbot did not raise an army. Instead, he offered a different kind of strength, a marriage. His son, Werner, would wed the Keyburg heiress not for passion alone, though affection would grow, but for peace, for stability, for the quiet weaving together of two threads that had long run parallel. The betrothal was not celebrated with fanfare. There were no tournaments, no feasts that lasted a week, no minstrel singing of destiny. It was sealed in a small stone chapel on a cool autumn morning, the air thick with the scent of beeswax and damp wool, the only witnesses a handful of family and trusted retainers. But in that simplicity lay its power. This was not a transaction shouted from a balcony. It was a covenant whispered before an altar, witnessed by God in memory. And in that moment, the Habsburg name stretched beyond its ridge for the first time, not by force, but by trust. Not by conquest, but by connection. The wind that swept through the valley that day carried more than leaves. It carried a new possibility, light as a seed, invisible to most, but already taking root in the soil of what would come. Elsewhere in Europe, kings were burning cities, popes were excommunicating emperors, and dukes were gambling their fortunes on the turn of a battle. But here, in the high valleys of the Argo, power was being redefined, not as something taken, but as something given. Merchants began to mention Radbot's name when arranging safe passage for their carts. Neighboring lords sought his counsel before making decisions that might affect the region. Even the Bishop of Constance, a man who rarely concerned himself with minor counts, sent a letter asking for his opinion on a dispute over tithes. Radbot read these messages slowly, often twice, and replied not with haste, but with carriage. Word chosen like a stone laid in a foundation. He understood that every reply, every promise, every act of fairness was another thread in a web that might one day hold more than he could imagine. Yet for all this quiet expansion, life within the walls of Habichtsburg remained unchanged in its essence. The hearth still burned at night. The children still played in the courtyard, their voices rising and falling like birdsong. The bread was still baked in the same oven, the ale still brewed from barley grown in their own fields. The difference was not in what they did, but in how the world saw them. Where once they had been simply present, now they were becoming necessary, a fixed point in a landscape that seemed to shift with every season. Reputation in those days was not built in a day. It was grown like a vine, slowly, patiently, clinging to the stones of consistent action. And the Habsburgs were tending that vine with hands that knew the value of time. Radbot never gathered his sons around the fire to tell them they would one day wear crowns. He taught them instead to read a charter with care, to treat a servant with the same respect as a bishop, to mend a fence before it fell, to keep their word even when no one was watching. He showed them that true strength lay not in taking, but in holding land, holding trust, holding a name clean of deceit. He did not speak of legacy, but he lived it in every choice, in every quiet act of responsibility. And in doing so, he planted seeds he would never live to see bloom. Seeds that the wind was already beginning to carry far beyond the ridges of their home. This was the beginning of the Habsburg way, not to rush, not to roar, but to grow. Like moss on stone, like roots in soil, like a name spoken first in one valley, then another still, until it was no longer just a name, but a presence. And all of it started not with a battle cry, but with a whisper carried on the wind, from a stone nest in the Alps, into the waiting silence of a changing world. can almost hear it now if you listen closely. The soft rustle of parchment, the murmur of a betrothal spoken in a chapel, the quiet certainty of a man who chose connection over conquest. This is how empires begin, not with a bang, but with a breath. So as you rest here in the quiet of your own room, imagine that breath brushing against your ear, the slow, steady rhythm of a name being carried forward, not by ambition, but by care. It is not loud. It does not demand attention, but it endures. And in the end, that is what changes the world. In the stillness that followed, the quiet agreement between the houses of Habichtsburg and Keyburg, nothing seemed to change on the surface of the world. Not in the way the barley swayed under the autumn sun, not in the rhythm of the bells that called villagers to prayer at dawn and dusk, not even in the path the wind took as it swept through the pine-covered ridges that separated one valley from the next, but beneath that calm, exterior, something had begun to stir, something slow and deep and irreversible, like the first pulse of a river finding its way through stone that had once seemed unbreakable. This marriage was never meant to be a spectacle. It never intended as a proclamation of ambition or a prelude to conquest, but rather a gentle act of stewardship. A quiet decision made in candlelit rooms between people who understood that the true strength of any land lay not in its borders, but in the trust that flowed across them, and in that simple choice to join two households, not through force, but through promise, lay the first real step in a journey that would one day stretch from the icy forests of Bohemia to the sun-drenched courtyards of Seville, not with the clang of swords or the thunder of hooves, but with the soft rustle of parchment signed in good faith and the steady hand of those who believed that to build was greater than to break. Werner, the son of Radbot and Ida, carried this new responsibility not as a burden or a badge of honor, but as a quiet companion that walked beside him through every day, shaping his steps without ever speaking aloud. He was not a man who sought the spotlight or craved the sound of his own name spoken in awe, but one who found meaning in the texture of ordinary life, the weight of soil in his palm, the sound of a cow lowing in the distance, the way light fell across a field at the end of a long summer day. And so, in the weeks after the betrothal, he did not retreat to draft grand plans or summon councils of advisors, but instead chose to walk, slowly and deliberately, through the lands that would now be his to care for, placing his boots on the same earth that generations of Keyburg villagers had walked before him, listening, not just to words, but to the silences between them, to the way an elder's voice softened when speaking of a lost harvest, to the quiet pride in a shepherd's eyes when describing the health of his flock, to the subtle differences in dialect that marked not division, but diversity, and in doing so, he began the slow, sacred work of belonging, not as a ruler imposing his will, but as a neighbor learning the names of the streams, the stories of the oldest oaks, the rhythms of festivals that had been celebrated long before his family's name had ever been spoken in these valleys, turning what could have been a cold legal union into something warm, living, and deeply human. The marriage itself did not unfold in a single day of celebration, but stretched across seasons like a vine finding its way up a stone wall, growing stronger with every passing moon. There were no grand processions with banners and trumpets, no feasts that lasted a week beneath starlit skies, no minstrels singing ballads of destiny. Instead, there were quiet gatherings held first in Keyburg, in a great hall whose wooden beams bore the smoke of centuries, and later in Habichtsburg, where the hearth still burned with the same steady flame that had warmed Werner's ancestors. And at these meetings, families came together not to witness a spectacle, but to weave the first threads of kinship through shared meals and unhurried conversation. Tables were laid with dark rye bread still warm from the oven, stewed apples sweetened with forest honey, wheels of cheese aged in cool cellars until their rinds were flecked, with mold like ancient maps, and wine drawn from casks that carried the taste of southern slopes, sun-warmed stone. Wild thyme and the faint tang of iron-rich soyland between bites. Silence would fall, not awkward or empty, but full of listening, of observation, of the slow and patient building of trust that cannot be hurried, cannot be forced, but only tended like a garden in early spring. And in this space, far from the eyes of courts and chronicles, a new kind of bond was born, one rooted not in power, but in presence. Gifts were exchanged during these gatherings, not as displays of wealth or status, but as quiet offerings of meaning, each one carrying the weight of intention rather than value. A Keyburg woodcarver presented a bowl shaped from a single piece of walnut, its grain swirling like the currents of a hidden river, its rims smoothed by hands that knew the language of grain and blade. A Habichtsburg weaver gave a shawl dyed with Alpine herbs gentian, for blue, yarrow for gold, madder root for red, its colors soft as twilight. Its fibers spun under the same roof where generations of women had sung lullabies while their fingers worked. A local monk, his eyes tired from years of copying sacred texts, gifted a small book of psalms, its pages filled not only with Latin verses but with delicate sketches of birds, flowers, and stars in the margins, as if to remind the reader that holiness lives not only in doctrine but in the world itself. These were not tokens meant for show or storage in a treasury, but quiet promises whispered without words. We honor your hands. We respect your ways. We wish to grow something together that outlives us both. And in these gestures, the marriage became less a transaction and more a covenant, not declared in stone, but lived in daily acts of care. Back in Habichtsburg, Radbot watched his son's journey with the same quiet steadiness that had guided his own life for decades. He offered no unsolicited advice, no lectures on power or legacy, for he understood that true wisdom is not given, but discovered through experience, and yet his presence remained a kind of anchor, a silent reminder that the foundation they had built over generations was not to be abandoned in favor of novelty or ambition. He continued to tend their original lands with the same meticulous care he always had, rising before dawn to check the condition of the millstones, walking the boundaries with a staff worn smooth by his father's hand, ensuring that the storehouses were sealed tightly against mice and damp. And in these acts, he taught without speaking that the heart of their family had always been rooted in fairness, in consistency, in the belief that land was not something to be owned, but something to be in relationship with, and that for the branches to reach far, the roots must hold fast to the soil from which they grew. So, while Werner learned the ways of Keyburg, Radbot held the hearth of Habichtsburg, not as a relic of the past, but as a living center from which new paths could safely unfold. Ida, for her part, wove her own quiet web of connection across the newly joined territories, not through formal letters or sealed decrees, but through the gentle art of correspondence that felt more like conversation than diplomacy. She wrote notes on thin sheets of parchment, folded them into small squares, and entrusted them to messengers who traveled between valleys, not as couriers of state, but as neighbors carrying news. In these letters, she shared recipes for healing teas, chamomile gathered at dawn for sleep, elderflower steeped in rainwater for fever, pine needles brewed into a tonic for winter cough sand. She asked after the Keyburg children by name, and inquired about the health of a new mother, or sent a skein of wool spun by her own hands with a suggestion for a stitch that might keep the cold out. These were not political maneuvers, but acts of care, intimate and sincere, and through them, she built a quiet sisterhood with the women of Keyburg, a network of trust that ran parallel to the official union, softening what could have been a cold alliance into something warm, human, and deeply rooted in the shared realities of daily life: birth, illness, harvest, grief, and in doing so, she ensured that the marriage would be nurtured not only in council chambers, but in kitchens, cradles, and hearths. As the months passed into a full turning of the seasons, the two territories began to breathe as one, not by decree, not by force, but by the quiet logic of shared need and mutual respect. Merchants who had once paused at the border, wary of double tolls or suspicious inspections, now rolled their carts freely between valleys, their wheels humming over the same roads that had once divided them, carrying salt from the mines, iron tools from distant forges, and bolts of cloth dyed in colors from both lands. Shepherds from Habichtsburg led their flocks to graze on Keyburg pastures in summer, their dogs barking the same commands in slightly different accents, and in return, Keyburg farmers sent sacks of rye, dried beans, and smoked hams to tide their new kin through lean winters. Even disputes that might once have sparked foods a diverted stream, a stolen chicken, a fence built a hand's breadth to far, were now brought before a shared court where elders from both sides sat together. It's not to declare a winner, but to restore balance, to speak until understanding was reached, and in this way, A new kind of governance emerged, not imposed from above, but grown from below, like moss spreading over stone. Patient, unobtrusive, and deeply rooted in the belief that peace is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of justice. Beyond their valleys, the wider world began to take quiet notice of this gentle integration. Neighboring lords, who had once dismissed the Habsburgs as minor counts from a remote ridge, now spoke of them with a new kind of respect, not because they had raised armies or claimed titles, but because they had done something far rarer in an age of fracture. They had built trust. Bishops who had ignored their petitions now replied with courtesy. Merchants sought safe passage through their lands. And even the emperor's agents, when passing through the region on their way to Constance or Zurich, made a point of stopping not out of obligation, but because they sensed that here in these high valleys, something rare was taking root: stability. And in a world where kingdoms crumbled over a single disputed inheritance, where alliances shattered over a missed payment or a slighted honor, stability was not just valuable, it was revolutionary. A quiet beacon in a landscape of noise and chaos, and the Habsburg name, once spoken only in local whispers, began to carry a new kind of weight not of power, but of reliability. Yet within the household, life remained grounded in the everyday rhythms that had always defined them. The same hands that signed charters also kneaded dough for the evening meal. The same voices that negotiated grazing rights also hummed lullabies at dusk to restless children. And there was no separation between the public and the private, because power in this world was not a performance to be staged, but a practice to be lived, woven into the fabric of daily life like thread in a well-worn cloak. Werner's wife, who would one day be remembered by historians only as the Kieberg heiress, though her influence ran deep, managed the household with the same quiet authority Ita had shown in Habichtsburg, teaching her children the old songs of both lands, ensuring that neither dialect was lost in the blending, and making sure that feast days honored both sets of ancestors with equal care. She understood that the true strength of this union lay not in land or title, but in the ability to hold two worlds in balance without letting either fall. And in that delicate act of holding, she became a quiet architect of a future that no one yet knew would stretch across continents. This was the Habsburg way in its infancy. It's a calculated strategy. It's not a doctrine written in books, but a disposition lived out in small choices, day after day, to move slowly, to listen before speaking, to honor before demanding, to believe that connection was stronger than control. And in that disposition lay a kind of quiet genius, one that would one day allow them to inherit half of Europe without firing a single arrow in anger, without shouting a single demand from a throne. For now, though, they were simply a family tending their lands, mending fences, raising children, and honoring promises made in candlelit rooms. And the map had not yet changed in the eyes of cartographers. But in the hearts of those who lived on the ground, the lines were already blurring, and something new was being born in the space between. Not with a crash, not with a decree, but with a sigh of relief when two strangers realized they were no longer strangers. And from that sigh, entire worlds could grow. As the quiet union between Habichtsburg and Kieberg settled into the rhythm of shared harvests and blended dialects, the world beyond their valleys began to shift in response, not with fanfare or sudden upheaval, but with the slow, almost imperceptible realignment of trust that occurs when one family proves, over time, that it can be relied upon in a landscape where loyalty is as fragile as morning frost. The merchants who traveled the old trade routes through Swabia and the Rhine now spoke of the Habsburg lands not as a minor stop along the way, but as a haven where contracts were honored without reminder, where tolls were fair and consistent, and where a traveler could sleep beneath a thatched roof without fear of theft or deception. And this quiet reputation, woven not from proclamations, but from daily acts of integrity, began to ripple outward, like the concentric rings that spread across a still pond after a single pebble has been dropped, touching the ears of bishops in Constance, the ledgers of bankers in Augsburg, and the private councils of lords who had long grown weary of alliances that crumbled at the first sign of difficulty. Elsewhere in the fractured tapestry of the Holy Roman Empire, where power was less a throne and more a series of uneasy bargains struck between dukes, or margraves and prince-bishops, the idea of a central authority had become more myth than reality. And in that vacuum of trust, the Habsburg name began to carry a new kind of weight, not because they demanded it, but because others began to lean on it. When a dispute arose between two neighboring counties over a disputed mill, it was not the emperors, agents who were called upon to mediate, but a letter sent to Radbot, whose word had become a quiet standard of fairness. When a harvest failed in the high valleys of Turgau, it was Werner's granaries that quietly sent grain, not as charity, but as reciprocity, a gesture that acknowledged their shared fate under the same sky. In these small, unrecorded acts, the Habsburgs became less a family and more a function of the landscape itself. Like a river that gives water to all who come to its banks without asking their name or creed. In the villages that now answered to both Habichtsburg and Keyburg, life changed in ways that were felt more than seen, like the slow deepening of color in a tapestry as thread after thread is added. Children who once played only with those from their own side of the ridge now gathered in shared meadows, their games blending old songs and new rules until it became impossible to tell where one tradition ended and the other began. At market days, which had once been held separately with cautious glances across the square, stalls now lined the same cobbled lane, their owners trading not just goods, but stories of winter storms, of stubborn goats, of dreams whispered into the dark hand in that mingling. Old suspicions softened like butter left in the sun, not because anyone declared peace, but because peace became the natural consequence of daily coexistence, of shared bread, of laughter echoing in a courtyard that no longer remembered its old divisions. But not all voices welcomed this quiet expansion with open arms. In the candlelit chambers of rival houses, the Keyburgs, who had lost their name to inheritance, the Zrangens, who watched their influence waned like a receding tide, the Wittelsbachs, who guarded their own power like a jealous flame, there were murmurs, soft but persistent, like the drip of water in a cave that slowly wears away stone. They grow too comfortable, some said over cups of spiced wine, their eyes narrowing at the mention of Habsburg fairness. They make peace look like weakness, others whispered, as if strength could only be measured in conquest. How can a family that never fights become so strong? These doubts were not shouted from balconies or written into manifestos, but exchanged in hushed tones behind closed doors, yet they carried a weight of their own, for resentment, even when silent, leaves its mark not in blood, but in the slow erosion of goodwill, in the subtle withdrawal of invitation, in the extra beat of silence before a toast. Still, the Habsburgs did not rise in defense or boast of their gains. Radbot, now older, his hair streaked with gray like frost on pine bark, continued to walk his lands with the same quiet attention he always had, his hands still calloused from mending fences, his eyes still sharp enough to notice when a field was overgrazed or a stream diverted. Werner, now managing both territories, made no show of his growing influence. He simply ensured that justice was blind, that harvests were shared in times of need, and that no village, whether old or new, felt forgotten. Their power was not worn on their sleeves, but woven into the fabric of daily life, felt in the fullness of a granary, the fairness of a judgment, the safety of a night journey, and it was this very lack of spectacle that made their rise so unsettling to those who measured strength by the clang of swords or the height of their towers. Beyond their valleys, the great wheels of empire began to turn in their direction, not with urgency, but with the quiet inevitability of a river finding its course. The Archbishop of Mainz, one of the 7 electors who chose the King of the Romans, took note of how smoothly the Habsburg lands were governed, how debts were paid on time, how disputes were settled without bloodshed, and how messengers sent through their territory always returned with their pouches intact. The Duke of Swabia, weary of constant feuds over grazing rights and river access, began to suggest Radbot's name in conversations about who might hold the peace in the south, not as a candidate for power, but as a natural anchor in a sea of drift. And when the imperial throne stood vacant after the death of Emperor William II of Holland, man who had ruled more in name than in fact, the question arose not just in Rome or Vienna, but in every castle from the Rhine to the Danube, who can hold this fractured world together? And the answer, to many, was not a warrior, but a steward, not a conqueror, but a keeper. And in that moment, the Habsburg name, once carried on the wind of marriage, was now carried on the breath of necessity. Yet within the walls of Habichtsburg, nothing changed in essence. The same hearth burned at night, its flames casting dancing shadows on walls worn smooth by generations. The same hands kneaded bread in the pre-dawn chill. The same lullabies were hummed to restless children, the same dogs curled beside the door after a long day of herding. There was no celebration when messengers arrived with news of growing influence. It's only quiet acknowledgement, followed by the turning of another page in the ledger of responsibilities. For the Habsburgs understood, even then, that true power was not in being chosen, but in being ready, and readiness was not a single act, but a lifetime of small choices made in the dark. Long before anyone was watching, long before the world had any idea that it would one day need them, you could feel the shift in the air now, as a storm, but as a change in pressure, like the stillness before dawn. Travelers spoke of the Habsburg lands with a new kind of respect, not because they were rich or grand, but because they were reliable. Scribes in distant monasteries began to copy their charters with extra care, not out of obligation, but because they sensed that these documents might one day be referenced as models of fairness. Even the wind, when it swept through the Alps, seemed to carry their name with a different weight, so that the mountains themselves were beginning to remember it, not as a claim, but as a promise kept across generations. This was not the moment they seized a crown. It was the moment the crown, heavy with expectation, exhaustion, and the dust of failed reigns, began to lean toward them, as if it, too, were tired of chaos and longed for hands that knew how to hold without squeezing, to carry without boasting, to serve without demanding reward. So as you listen now, imagine that quiet turning of the world, the way a reputation, built grain by grain, season by season, can one day become a foundation for something vast. The way a family that never asked for power can find it resting gently in their palms, not because they reached for it, but because the world had nowhere else to place it. This is how history moves, not always with thunder, but sometimes with the soft sigh of relief when someone finally says, "I will hold this for you," and in that sigh, a new chapter begins, not with a coronation, but with a question whispered in 1,000 places at once. What if they are the ones? And in that question, the Habsburgs did not find glory but responsibility, not triumph, but duty, not a throne, but a path, quiet and narrow, winding upward through the mist, illuminated not by torches, but by the steady glow of a name that had, over centuries, learned to mean something true. As the Habsburg name grew heavier, not with gold or titles, but with the quiet weight of trust that others had placed upon it, like a mantle woven from countless small promises kept, the air around their lands began to shift in ways that were felt more than seen, like the subtle change in pressure that comes before a storm that never quite arrives. In the valleys that now answered to both Habichtsburg and Keyburg, life continued with its familiar rhythms, the clatter of looms at dusk, the lowing of cattle returning from pasture, the scent of wood smoke curling through the pine's butt beneath that surface calm. Something new had taken root, the quiet awareness that their growing influence was no longer invisible to the wider world. And that visibility, however gentle, always stirs the still waters of envy, doubt, and unspoken rivalry, for when one family begins to hold more than others believe they should, the silence that follows is never empty, but filled with the soft hum of questions whispered behind closed doors. In candlelit chambers where wine flows just a little too freely and loyalty is weighed like grain in a merchant's scale, the Wittelsbachs, from their grand halls in Bavaria, watched the Habsburg rise not with open hostility, but with a slow, simmering unease that colored every letter they sent and every envoy they received. They had long considered themselves the natural heirs to the southern German lands, their lineage traced back to dukes who had sat at the emperor's right hand, their courts adorned with Flemish tapestries and Italian glass, their daughters married to princes whose names echoed in the chronicles of Christendom, to see a family from a remote Alpine ridge, whose fortress had once been little more than a stone watchtower perched above a stream, now gain the ear of bishops, the trust of merchants. And the quiet favor of imperial agents felt less like a natural evolution and more like a quiet insult to the unspoken order of things. An order in which birth mattered more than behavior and legacy more than consistency. And so, though they never declared enmity, their courtesies grew cooler, their invitations rarer, their compliments laced with a subtle sharpness, as if each word were a needle stitching doubt into the fabric of public opinion, thread by thread, until the Habsburg name, once spoken with warmth, now carried a faint echo of suspicion in certain circles. Not because they had done anything wrong, but because they had done everything too well. Even within the blended territories of Habichtsburg and Keyburg, questions began to stir in the loud voices of rebellion. But in the quiet corners of village life, in the hushed conversations between elders as they mended fishing nets by the riverbank or sorted grain in the dim light of autumn afternoons, some remembered the days when borders were clear, when loyalties were simple. A man knew exactly whose name to call in times of trouble. Now, in this new world of shared courts and blended dialects, they wondered whether fairness had become a kind of weakness, whether a lord who never raised his voice could truly command respect, or whether kindness, when offered too freely, would be mistaken for indifference. A ruler should be feared as well as loved, one old shepherd murmured to his grandson as they walked the high pastures, his eyes fixed on the distant ridgeline where the Habsburg banner now flew alongside the Keyburg sigil. What happens when a neighbor sees generosity as permission to take more? These were not accusations, but anxiety soft as ash, yet capable of smothering trust if left unattended. Werner, now bearing the full weight of his father's legacy, felt each of them like a pebble in his boot, small, persistent, shaping the way he walked, the way he listened, the way he chose his words in council. For he knew that to be doubted by those you serve is a heavier burden than any enemy's sword. Radbot, though, aging his hair now silver like frost on pine bark, his hands marked with the map of a lifetime's labor, remained the quiet compass of the family, his presence a steady flame in a world of shifting winds. He did not respond to slights with counterslides, nor to whispers with louder proclamations. Instead, he doubled down on what had always defined them: consistency. When a Wittelsbach envoy arrived one autumn afternoon with thinly veiled demands about grazing rights near the contested borderlands, Radbot received him not in the great hall, but in the smaller solar where the family took their evening meals, a space that spoke not of power, but of intimacy. He offered the man wine from their best cask, the one aged in oak from the Keyburg Hillsand bread baked that morning by Ida's own hands. And only after the guest had eaten and the fire had settled into a soft glow did he gently, firmly remind him of the old agreements that had kept peace between their families for 3 generations. Not as a threat, but as a shared memory, a thread of continuity that neither should be eager to break. There was no anger in his voice, only the calm certainty of a man who knew his ground, both literally and morally. And in that calmness lay a kind of power that frustrated his rivals even more, because it could not be matched with noise or force, only endured, like the slow wearing of stone by water, the patient growth of moss over a forgotten boundary marker. Meanwhile, in the monasteries and scriptoria, where the records of the realm were kept, those quiet sanctuaries where time moved like honey and ink was mixed with, rainwater scribes began to note a subtle shift in how the Habsburg name was written. It was not in the grand chronicles meant for emperors or popes, but in the humble documents of daily life. Land deeds sealed with wax, marriage contracts copied onto vellum, letters exchanged between bishops and bailiffs. Where once the Habsburgs had been listed among dozens of minor counts, their name now appeared near the top, sometimes even before families with older titles but thinner reputations. This was not an official elevation, not a decree from on high, but a quiet acknowledgement of influence, and such acknowledgments once made in ink were hard to unmake. Yet the Habsburgs never drew attention to it. They simply continued to sign their letters with the same modest hand, the same unadorned seal, as if the growing weight of their name were not theirs to carry, but the world's to place upon them, and in that humility they disarmed even their critics. For how could one accuse a man of ambition when he never claimed what others freely gave? Within the household, courage took a different form, not in grand gestures or bold declarations, but in the daily choice to remain open in the face of suspicion, to welcome even those who had spoken ill of them, to treat doubt with patience rather than defensiveness. now a grandmother whose hands still moved with the grace of a weaver, though her eyes had grown tired from years of needlework. Taught her daughters-in-law to host even the most reluctant guests, with the same bread, the same wine, the same warmth that they gave to kin. "Let them see that our home has no hidden corners," she would say, her voice soft but firm, as she smoothed a tablecloth before a shared meal. For a house built on secrecy will always feel like a prison, even to its owners. And Werner, though burdened by the strain of holding two worlds together, made a point of walking the fields alone at dawn, not to inspect, but to remember to feel the cool dampness of the soil beneath his boots, to hear the first birds of the day before the noise of the world began, to reconnect with the simple truth that power meant nothing if it could not protect peace, and that peace was not the absence of conflict, but the presence of trust, patiently built, carefully tended, never assumed. The tension never erupted into open conflict, not yet, but it lived in the spaces between words, in the extra beat of silence before a toast at a shared feast, in the way a messenger might arrive with news just slightly too late, in the careful avoidance of certain topics when lords from different houses gathered in neutral halls. It was a war without banners, fought not on battlefields but in the architecture of trust, and the Habsburgs knew they could not win it by fighting. So they chose a different path. To be so undeniably fair, so unwaveringly present, that even their rivals would one day find themselves relying on them in moments of crisis. It was a long game, played in whispers, and it required a courage that left no scars but ran deeper than bone, the courage to be misunderstood and still choose kindness, to be doubted and still keep your word, to be envied and still offer your hand without hesitation, without expectation of return, because they understood that true strength was not in being feared, but in being relied upon, even by those who would never admit it aloud. You could feel it now in the air of every gathering, the hush that fell over a room, when two old allies realized they were no longer equals. The way a handshake lingered a moment too long with unspoken meaning, the soft rustle of a letter being folded just so to hide the tremor in the hand that wrote it. These were the battles of this era. Not loud, not glorious, but real. And in them, the Habsburgs learned that the hardest thing to defend was not land, but reputation. It's not wealth, but the quiet belief that fairness could be a form of strength, and that to hold power gently was not weakness, but wisdom, refined through generations of watching empires rise and fall on the brittle foundation of pride. They did not seek to dominate, only to endure it in that endurance. They found a kind of victory that left no monuments, but shaped the very soil upon which future generations would walk. Even within the family, doubt sometimes flickered like a candle in a draught. Werner's younger brother Otto, who had once dreamed of knighthood and distant crusades, now watched his brother manage lands through marriage and mediation, and wondered if their path had grown too soft, too quiet, too easily dismissed by the warriors of the age who measured a man's worth by the scars on his body rather than the integrity in his word. He did not speak his thoughts aloud, but they lived in the way he lingered near the armory, in the extra time he spent sharpening a sword he would never use, the way his eyes followed the messengers who came from courts where glory was still sung in ballads. And Radbot, sensing this restlessness, not through words, but through silence, the kind of silence that a father learns to read in his son's posture, did not scold or correct, but one evening, as they stood together on the ramparts watching the mist rise from the valley like a slow exhalation of the earth, he said, "Only a sword protects what the hand builds. But if the hand never builds, the sword has nothing to guard." And in those few words, spoken softly against the backdrop of a fading twilight, he reminded his son that true strength lies not in the weapon, but in what you choose to protect, and that legacy is not written in blood, but in bread shared, in promises kept, in borders made not to divide, but to connect. And in the villages where the people lived closest to the earth and furthest from courts, the conflict was felt as a quiet, uneasy hesitation before sharing news with a stranger, a slight pause before offering a traveler shelter, a watchfulness in the eyes of shepherds when they saw a rider with unfamiliar colors. They were not against the Habsburgs. They were wary of change. For change, even when it brings peace, also brings uncertainty, and uncertainty breeds fear. And so the Habsburgs worked not to convince, but to demonstrate through fair prices at market, through swift justice in the square, through the quiet presence of their children playing with local boys and girls, through the way Werner's wife would stop to ask after a sick neighbor or send herbs from their garden till the fear softened, not because it was argued away, but because it was lived through. Day after day, season after season, until trust became not a belief, but a habit, and peace, not a hope, but a way of life. First, this was the silent war they waged not for glory, but for continuity. Not for dominance, but for dignity. And in it, they discovered that the most enduring victories are not those that echo in chronicles, but those that settle into the fabric of daily life. So, it began not with trumpets echoing through cathedral arches, not with torches flaring in the night, not with proclamations shouted from balconies to crowds gathered below in awe or anticipation, but with silence, the kind of deep, waiting silence that falls over Europe in the hours just before dawn, when even the wind seems to hold its breath and the stars burn a little brighter, as if the sky itself understands that something rare is about to happen, something that will not announce itself with fanfare, but will settle into the world like mist over a river, visible only in hindsight. In a chamber somewhere between Flanders and the Alps perhaps, in a modest townhouse in Ghent, with windows shuttered against the autumn chill, the glass fogged from the warmth of too many bodies in too small a space. Perhaps in a borrowed room above an apothecary's shop in Augsburg, where the scent of dried lavender and crushed rosemary still lingered in the air despite the late hour. The room was lit by a single oil lamp, whose flame cast long, trembling shadows on the walls. And around a heavy wooden table, scarred by centuries of use and stained with wine and ink, sat a handful of men whose names would barely survive in history, whose faces would never grace a coin or a fresco, yet whose choice that night made, not in haste but in exhaustion, not in ambition but in quiet desperation, would echo through centuries not because they sought to change the world, but because they were asked to choose who might hold it together when it seemed on the verge of falling apart, and in that moment they did not reach for glory. They reached for steadiness, for someone whose family had for 400 years chosen to mend rather than break. The Holy Roman Empire, that ancient and unwieldy patchwork of duchies, bishoprics, free cities, mountain valleys, river kingdoms, and scattered villages that spoke a dozen dialects and owed loyalty to a dozen different banners, had no clear heir. The old emperor, Maximilian I, was gone buried beneath layers of ceremony, debt, and unfulfilled dreams. His body laid to rest in a crypt lined with marble saints who watched over him with blank, eternal eyes, his coffers empty from endless wars he could never quite finish. His vision of unity half-realized at best. His final letters filled not with triumph but with weary requests for funds that never came, now the 7 electors. Those powerful princes and archbishops who alone held the ancient, almost sacred right to name a new king of the Romans, faced a choice that felt less like an election and more like a gamble with the soul of Christendom itself. A gamble made heavier by the fact that the world around them was fracturing in ways no one had foreseen. From the east, Ottoman Empire pressed against the borders like a rising tide, its drums growing louder each year. From within, the voices of reformers like Martin Luther were spreading through newly printed pamphlets like wildfire through dry grass, challenging not just the church, but the very idea of a unified faith. And from the west, France watched with hungry eyes ready to pounce on any sign of weakness. In this climate of uncertainty, the electors did not seek a warrior or a poet, they sought a steward, someone whose name carried not the glitter of novelty, but the quiet weight of consistency. And before them stood 2 names. One was Francis of France, brilliant, charismatic, fluent in Latin and Italian, backed by the glittering wealth of the Renaissance and the promise of a new kind of monarchy that danced with art and power in equal measure, a man whose court would become a stage for human genius. The other was a young man barely 20, born not in Vienna or Madrid, but in Ghent quiet. A thoughtful boy raised by his grandmother in a household where French was spoken, but German was feared, who had inherited not 1 crown, but 3, before he had truly learned to shave, and whose name carried the quiet weight of a family that had, for 4 centuries, chosen patience over pride, fairness over force, and presence over spectacle. His name was Charles. Charles of Ghent, Charles of Habsburg. And though he did not know it yet, The world was already beginning to call him Charles V, but, on that night, or rather in the weeks of quiet negotiation that led to it, he was still just a young man sitting by a window in a borrowed room, staring at the stars, wondering if he was ready to carry the weight of a name that had grown too large for one lifetime. He had not sought this moment. He had not trained for it in the way princes were supposed to, with tutors drilling him in rhetoric and strategy, with knights teaching him the art of the joust, with ambassadors testing his wit in mock councils. Instead, he had grown up in the quiet rhythms of a Flemish household, where the greatest lessons were taught not in books, but in the daily practice of duty: how to greet a messenger with respect, how to sign a letter with care, how to listen more than you speak, how to remember the name of a servant's child. And now, that quiet upbringing was being tested not in a classroom, but on a stage that spanned half the known world, a stage where every misstep could mean rebellion, war, or the unraveling of a fragile peace. And though he would one day be remembered for his counsels, his wars, his abdications, the true weight of his life began not in action, but in reception, in the moment he was chosen, not for what he had done, but for what his ancestors had quietly, patiently built. But on that night, or rather, in the shadowed rooms where decisions were truly made, far from the eyes of chronicles and crowds, the world did not shudder. There were no fireworks, no bells ringing across the empire, only a slow, almost imperceptible shift, like the turning of a great key in a lock that had not been opened in 100 years. A shift felt not in the streets, but in the sealed letters exchanged between men who understood that history is not made by the loudest voice, but by the one that stays calm when everything else is trembling. The negotiations were not held in grand cathedrals with vaulted ceilings that echoed every word, but in private chambers, over late-night meals where wine loosened tongues just enough to reveal true intentions, where conversations circled not around glory, but around practical concerns: grain stores for the coming winter, the cost of hiring Swiss mercenaries, the safety of trade routes through the Alps, the loyalty of border lords who might switch sides at the first sign of weakness. Bribes were offered not in crude bags of coin that clinked with greed, but in promises whispered over shared bread, assurances that certain trade routes would remain open, that certain bishops would keep their seats, that certain cities would retain their freedoms, that certain families would be protected from ruin. And behind it all, woven into every word in silence, stood the legacy of Radbot and Werner, of marriages made in chapels, of land held without greed, of a reputation built grain by grain over 4 centuries. Charles did not win the crown through charisma or force of will or dazzling intellect. He inherited it through the quiet compounding of trust, like interest on a loan that no one had ever asked to be repaid, and in an age when oaths were broken as easily as twigs. That kind of reliability was rarer than gold. And when the decision was finally made, not with a vote shouted in an assembly for all to hear, but with sealed letters exchanged under moonlight, their wax imprinted with ancient sigils that had witnessed dozens of such choices before, their contents known only to a handful of men who would carry the secret to their graves, the world did not erupt in celebration. There were no processions winding through candlelit streets, no feasts that lasted a week, no minstrels singing of destiny in taverns from Prague to Seville. Only a slow, quiet exhalation, as if the empire itself had been holding its breath for years and could finally rest. Finally trust that someone would take the weight off its shoulders, even if just for a time. From that moment, Charles would wear more crowns than any man in history: King of Spain, Archduke of Austria, Lord of the Netherlands, Duke of Burgundy, and soon, Emperor of the Romans. His domains would stretch from the sun-baked plazas of Seville, where orange trees bloomed year-round and the scent of saffron filled the air, to the icy forests of Bohemia, where wolves still howled at the moon and snow clung to the pines well into spring, from the silver mines of Potosi, where the earth itself seemed to bleed precious metal, to the spice markets of the Moluccas, where the air was thick with the scent of cloves and nutmeg, from the canals of Venice, where gondolas glided like shadows through moonlit water, to the monasteries of Ireland, where monks copied ancient texts by candlelight, far from the noise of empires. Yet on that night he was still just a young man sitting by a window, staring at the stars. feeling the terrible weight of a name that had grown too large for one lifetime, and wondering, with a quiet ache in his chest, if he would ever again know the simple peace of anonymity. Within the Habsburg household, the news was met, not with celebration, but with solemnity. There were no feasts, no banners unfurled from the ramparts, no trumpets sounding at dawn. Only quiet prayers in the chapel, the lighting of an extra candle for guidance before the statue of the Virgin Mary, and the careful folding of new maps that now bore their crest in half a dozen places across the continent, maps that felt less like triumphs and more like burdens. The women of the family, mothers, aunts, grandmothers, exchanged glances heavy with understanding, their eyes speaking what their lips would not. They knew that power of this magnitude was not a gift but a burden, and that the price of wearing so many crowns would be paid not in gold, but in sleepless nights spent staring at the ceiling while the world burned in distant lands. In missed birthdays of children who would grow up knowing their father more as a portrait than a presence. In the slow erosion of a private self beneath the weight of a public name that no longer belonged to him but to history. Ida's descendants, now spread across courts from Brussels to Vienna, would write letters not of triumph, but of concern. Is he eating? Does he sleep? Does he still remember the smell of pine in the Alps? Because they understood that to be chosen by history is to be separated from the ordinary joys of life, and that no amount of glory can replace the warmth of a hearth shared with those who know you, not for your title, but for your silence, for your kindness, for the way you fold your hands when you're thinking deeply. You can almost feel it now, the hush of that room, the rustle of a pen signing a document that will never be seen by the public. The way a young man's breath catches as he realizes the world has just been placed in his hands, not as a reward, but as a responsibility he never asked for. This was not a moment of triumph, but of surrender to duty, to lineage, to a path that was no longer his to choose, to a name that had grown roots deeper than he could ever pull up. And yet, in that surrender, a new kind of empire was born, not built on conquest, but woven through inheritance, not held by armies, but stitched together by the quiet thread of a family that had, for generations, chosen to build rather than break, to listen rather than command, to endure rather than explode. The Habsburgs did not reach for the world. The world, exhausted and afraid, simply leaned into their arms, trusting that their hands coalesced, not by swords, but by the steady work of stewardship. By the signing of charters, by the mending of fences would not let it fall, and in that trust, something extraordinary happened. An empire was born not from fire, but from faith. And in the days that followed, nothing changed outwardly. The same carts rolled through the same market squares, their wheels humming over cobblestones worn smooth by centuries of use. The same children played in the same courtyards, their laughter echoing off stone walls that had seen dozens of rulers come and go. The same shepherds led their flocks to the same high pastures, their dogs barking the same commands and dialects unchanged by the turning of dynasties. But beneath the surface, the world had tilted on its axis, not with a crash, but with a sigh. Messengers now carried new seals on their letters. Scribes added new titles to old documents, and in the courts of Europe, conversations that once began with "What will the emperor do?" now carried the unspoken question, "What will Charles do?" Not as a boy, but as a symbol, as a vessel for stability in a time of fracture, as the living embodiment of a name that had, over centuries, learned to mean something true. And though he would one day be remembered for his wars, his counsels, his retreat to a monastery, the true turning point was not in any battle or decree, but in that quiet night when a handful of men, weary of chaos, chose a young man not for what he had done, but for what his family had always been, reliable, steady, present. So as you listen now, imagine that turning point not as a climax, but as a quiet exhale in the long night of history. The kind of moment that goes unnoticed by most, yet changes everything. For in that room, on that night, the Habsburgs did not reach for the world. Exhausted and afraid, simply leaned into their arms, and from that embrace, an empire would rise not with a roar, but with a whisper, the kind of whisper that carries across centuries, because it speaks not of power, but of patience, not of conquest, but of care, not of noise, but of the deep, quiet certainty that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply to stay, to listen, and to hold on. And in that whisper, you can hear the echo of every quiet choice that ever changed the course of history, not made in fire, but in faith, not in fury, but in fairness, not by the loudest voice, but by the one that stayed, listened, and remained on. If you listen very closely, beneath the sound of your own breath, you might just hear it still. For all the lands that bowed beneath the weight of Habsburg crowns, for all the titles that gathered like layers of velvet and gold around Charles V, wrapping him in a mantle so heavy it threatened to pull him into the earth. There were things no map could ever chart, no chronicle could ever capture, no triumphal arch could ever commemorate. These were the silent losses, the quiet hollows that opened in the soul when power became so vast it could no longer be held in human hands. When the world demanded you be everywhere at once and you realized, in the stillness of a room lit only by a single guttering candle, that you could not even be fully present in one moment, let alone a lifetime. The sun shone brightly on his palaces in Madrid, where orange trees bloomed in courtyards paved with marble from Carrara. On his fortresses along the Rhine, where banners snapped in the wind like the wings of restless birds. On the gilded caravels setting sail from Seville, with holds full of silver and spices and dreams that would never come. True, but it never reached the rooms where he sat alone after midnight. Long after the last servant had retired, staring at letters he could not answer because there were too many. Mourning children he could not hold because duty had taken them from him before their voices had fully formed. Grieving a simplicity, he would never know again the soft weight of a child's head resting on his shoulder as they fell asleep in his arms. The unguarded laughter of a friend who did not call him Your Majesty, but simply Charles, the quiet rhythm of a life shaped by choice rather than obligation, where a walk in the garden was just a walk, not a performance watched by eyes hidden in every shadow. The cost of holding an empire that spanned time zones where dawn broke over the silver mines of Potosi, while dusk settled like a sigh over the canals of Ghent, was measured not in ducats or florins, not in treaties signed or battles won, but in absence. Charles missed the birth of his daughter in Valladolid because he was negotiating with Lutheran princes in Augsburg, his hands signing peace accords while his heart ached for a moment he would never get back. A moment he would only hear about later in a letter written in his wife's careful hand. He received news of his mother's death in a sealed packet carried by a messenger who had ridden for days through rain and mud, his horse stumbling more than once in the dark, and he read it alone in a borrowed chamber in Innsbruck. The fire long since burned 2 embers, his eyes dry not from lack of feeling, but from exhaustion so deep it had worn sorrow into silence, leaving only a dull ache behind his ribs, like a stone too heavy to lift. He held the hand of his infant son only a handful of times before sending him to be raised by others, by tutors, by nannies, by courtiers who would teach him to stand straight and speak properly, but never to laugh freely, because a king could not afford the luxury of a father's daily presence. The world needed an emperor, and emperors, it seemed, had no right to private joys, no right to ordinary grief, no right to the small, sacred moments that stitch a life together. These were not grand tragedies sung by minstrels in taverns or painted in frescoes on cathedral walls. They were the small, aching absences that accumulate in a life lived for duty rather than desire, the kind of sorrow that does not cry out, but settles in the bones like winter damp, cold and persistent, shaping the way you walk, the way you sleep, the way you look at a child without seeing your own and wonder if they even know your face. In the empire itself, for all its splendor, seemingly endless reach, its vaults overflowing with treasure from newly discovered worlds. It's a house built on shifting sand, its foundations strained by the sheer impossibility of unity, stretched too thin across too many tongues, too many faiths, too many loyalties that had nothing to do with crowns or charters. In Spain, the people grumbled that their king spoke French, not Castilian, that he spent more time in Flanders than in Toledo, that he taxed them to fund wars they did not believe in, that he cared more for German princes and their theological squabbles than for Spanish peasants struggling to feed their families. In Germany, the princes resented his insistence on Catholic unity, even as Luther's words spread like wildfire through the printing presses of Wittenberg, carried on cheap paper by students and merchants who saw in them not heresy, but hope for a faith that spoke to the heart, not just to the altar. In the Netherlands, his birthplace, merchants whispered that he governed with the mind of a Spaniard and the heart of a foreigner. that he taxed their canals and harbors to pay for battles in lands they had never seen and did not care about, that he had forgotten the muddy streets where he had taken his first steps. In the New World, ships returned laden with silver, yes, but also with reports of rebellion, of disease sweeping through indigenous villages like shadow, of moral unease among the friars, who questioned whether such wealth was worth the cost in souls, whether God truly blessed empires built on the backs of the conquered, the very thing that made the Habsburg dominion astonishing its sheer scale. Its impossible ambition to hold half the world under one name also made it impossible to govern with the personal touch, the quiet fairness, the patient listening that had once defined their rise in the Alpine valleys. You cannot know every village when your realm has 10,000 of them. You cannot hear every voice when they speak a dozen languages, pray to 100 saints, and carry grievances older than your dynasty. And in that impossibility, Charles felt not failure, but futility, a quiet, grinding weariness that no amount of victory could soothe. Charles felt this fracture not as a sudden break, not as a collapse, but as a slow, relentless erosion, a sense that no matter how early he rose, how late he stayed awake with candlelight burning his eyes until they watered, how meticulously he reviewed every dispatch from every corner of his domains, the world would always be slipping through his fingers like water through a cup with cracks too fine to see, too deep to mend. He wrote letters filled with painstaking detail about grain stores in Sicily, troop movements near Tunis, the health of his daughter in Portugal, the loyalty of a border lord in Hungary, yet his own handwriting grew shakier with each passing year, the ink sometimes smudged by a trembling hand, or a drop of something that might have been sweat, or might have been something else entirely, as if his body knew what his mind refused to admit, that no one man, not even one with the blood of Radbot and Ida in his veins, not even one blessed by popes and feared by sultans, could hold together a world that no longer wanted to be held as one. The dream of a unified Christendom under one crown and one faith was fading, not with a crash, not with a battle lost or a city burned, but with a whisper, a sigh, 1,000 small refusals to belong to something so vast it had no heart. And Charles, for all his power, could not silence that whisper, only listen to it grow louder with every passing season, until it filled his dreams and woke him in the dark, drenched in cold sweat, reaching for a map that no longer made sense. And yet in that exhaustion, in that quiet surrender to the limits of what one man could carry, a strange kind of clarity began to bloom, not the clarity of victory, not the sharp certainty of a general on the eve of battle, but the soft, gentle clarity of a man who has finally stopped pretending. He began to understand that the Habsburg way, the way of his ancestors. It's a way of patience, of marriage, of quiet stewardship, of building trust one village at a time, was not designed for ruling a global empire forged in conquest, gold, and gunpowder. It was made for tending valleys, for listening at borders, for weaving connection where others saw only division. The world had given them more than their method could bear, more than their hearts could hold. And rather than break it or break himself in the trying, he would have to divide it, not as a failure, but as an act of wisdom. And so, with the same quiet resolve that had guided his ancestors when they chose peace over pride, when they walked their lands not as lords but as neighbors, Charles made his most radical choice. He would give it all away, not in anger, not in defeat, not in despair, but as an act of mercy to his people, who deserved rulers who could truly see them. To his family, who deserved a father and a brother who could be present, not just a symbol. And to himself, who deserved, after decades of holding the world, the simple grace of setting it down. He split the inheritance not as a king dividing spoils, not as a warrior carving up conquered lands, but as a weary father passing burdens to his sons with a whispered hope that they might carry them more lightly, with hands less worn, hearts less weary. To his brother Ferdinand he gave the Austrian lands, the German titles. The ancient heart of the Habsburg name, the stone nest in the Alps, now grown into a mountain of legacy, where the air still carried the scent of pine and damp earth, where the silence still held the echo of Radbot's footsteps on the ramparts, where power could once again be local, personal, human. To his son Philip, he gave Spain, the Netherlands, the Americas, the sun-drenched empire where the sun never set, where power would be exercised through ritual, faith, and the slow, steady turning of bureaucratic wheels. where distance could be managed not by presence, but by paper and to himself. He gave silence a small monastery and used, tucked into the hills of Extremadura, far from courts and councils, far from the noise of history, where the only sounds were the wind and the olive trees, the bells marking the hours of prayer, and the slow, steady rhythm of his own breath, returning to itself after decades of holding it in service to a world that never stopped asking for more, never stopped demanding, never stopped taking. In that retreat, stripped of crowns and councils, of titles and expectations, now Charles finally returned to the essence of what his family had always been at its core. Not rulers, but stewards. He spent his days tending a small garden behind the monastery walls, his hands in the soil once more, planting rosemary and sage and thyme not for ceremony, not for show, but for their scent, for the way they released their fragrance when brushed by a passing hand. He repaired clocks, not as a symbol of his mastery over time had mastered him long ago, but because their quiet ticking soothed him, because in their steady rhythm he found a peace that no empire had ever given him. He walked the same narrow path each afternoon, watching the light shift across the stone walls, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face without thinking of the lands it touched beyond the horizon, without calculating how many subjects were waking or sleeping under that same light. He no longer decided the fate of nations, but he learned again how to feel the coolness of water in his cup, how to sleep through the night without nightmares of rebellion or bankruptcy or faith lost, how to speak without an audience, how to be simply Charles, not emperor, not king, not defender of the faith, but a man who had carried the world and, at last, set it down with gentle hands, and in doing so, found himself again. You can almost feel it now, the hush of that monastery garden, the scent of dry earth and rosemary carried on the afternoon breeze, the way time slows when there is nothing left to prove, no one left to impress, no empire left to hold together. This was not the end of the Habsburg story, but a necessary pause, a breath drawn deep after centuries of steady climbing, a moment of stillness in a lineage that had rarely allowed itself to rest. For every gain, there is a loss. For every crown, a shadow. And sometimes the greatest act of courage is not to hold on with white knuckles, not to double down in the face of collapse, but to let go gently, gratefully, without regret, without shame. Charles did not fail because he stepped down. He succeeded because he recognized the limits of human capacity and chose humility over collapse. Peace over pretense, truth over the illusion of control. And in that choice, he honored not just himself, but the quiet wisdom of his ancestors, who had always known that true strength lies not in how much you hold, but in knowing when to release. And in that humility, he left a lesson deeper than any decree, more enduring than any monument. That power is not measured by how much you accumulate, but by how wisely you release what was never truly yours to keep. That legacy is not built in the glare of public triumph, but in the quiet rooms where you finally allow yourself to rest, to breathe, to be human. That even emperors are mortal, and their humanity, their fatigue, their doubt, their longing for stillness, or quiet tears shed in rooms no one ever saws, where we find the most enduring truth of all. For history remembers crowns, but the soul remembers kindness. History records wars, but the heart remembers peace. And what the sun never saw, the private grief, the silent surrender. The gentle letting go is often what changes us most deeply, what teaches us that to be human is not to rule the world, but to find your place within it, and then, when the time comes, to step aside with grace. So as you rest here, imagine that quiet surrender, the unfastening of a crown not with bitterness but with relief, as if it had been too heavy for too long. The closing of a ledger not with frustration but with acceptance, as if every entry, every error, every triumph had led to this one necessary moment. The final letter signed not with flourish but with peace, the ink drying slowly in the afternoon light. For even those who hold the world in their hands must one day remember how to hold only their own breath in that breath. In that stillness, in that silence that the sun never saw, they find the light that never needed a crown to shine. After the quiet retreat of Charles V to his monastery in Used, and the careful, almost tender division of his vast inheritance between his son and his brother, the Habsburg story did not indict deepened. Like a river that has reached the plains and begins to branch into countless quiet channels, each one carrying the same water but shaping new lands in its own time. The empire was no longer one body, but two branches growing in different soils under different skies, yet still fed by the same hidden roots, still whispering to each other through the unseen networks of kinship, memory, and shared duty that had always defined them. In Madrid, Philip II inherited the sun-drenched domains of Spain, the Americas, and the Netherlands, a realm of gold, faith, and fire, where power was exercised through ritual, parchment, and the slow turning of bureaucratic wheels. In Vienna, Ferdinand I took the older, colder lands, Austria, Bohemia, Hungary, and the mantle of the Holy Roman Empire, realm of stone, treaties, snow, and the constant hum of diplomacy along shifting borders. Though they ruled in different tongues and under different stars, both carried the same quiet understanding that had guided their ancestors since the days of Habichtsburg. Power is not held by force, but woven through connection, and legacy is not declared, it is lived, day after patient day. And so, the Habsburgs returned to their oldest and most trusted art, not conquest, not war, not spectacle, but kinship. But with the same patient precision their forebears had used when binding Habichtsburg to Keyburg centuries before. Only now the scale had grown from valleys to kingdoms, from villages to continents. A daughter of Spain was sent to France, not as a prisoner of politics, but as a promise of peace. Her trousseau filled not just with silks and jewels, but with letters of guarantee, maps of shared borders, and the quiet hope that her children might one day speak both tongues without choosing sides. A son of Austria wed a princess of Portugal, their union sealed not in a week of feasting, but in a series of quiet negotiations that ensured trade routes would stay open and border disputes would be settled by councils, not cannons. A niece of the emperor became Queen of Poland, her dowry including not just lands and treasure, but a commitment to mutual defense, to shared schools. These were not grand romantic unions celebrated in sonnets or immortalized in paintings, but quiet agreements sealed in chapels. Their terms written in Latin, their promises measured not in passion but in dowries, duchies, and the slow accumulation of trust across generations. The phrase that would one day become their unofficial motto, Bella Gerant Ali, to Felix Austria Nubi, let others wage war. You, happy Austria, Mary, was not yet spoken aloud in courts or copied into chronicles. But it lived in every decision, in every betrothal contract signed by candlelight, in every carefully chosen portrait sent across mountains and seas as a prelude to alliance. Where other dynasties built fortresses of stone and filled their treasuries with spoils of war, the Habsburgs built family trees, branching, intertwining, reaching across borders not with armies, but with names. Where others spent fortunes on cannons and mercenaries, they spent them on dowries, on envoys fluent in 3 languages, on the quiet education of their children in the customs, prayers, and songs of lands they might one day rule not by sword, but by marriage alone. It was a strategy so gentle it seemed almost passive to those who measured strength only in noise and blood. Yet it reshaped the map of Europe more surely, more lastingly, than any battle ever could. Because it did not just redraw lines, it rewove the very fabric of loyalty, turning strangers into kin, rivals into in-laws, enemies into distant cousins who might one day meet at a christening and find, to their surprise, that they shared the same grandmother. In the Spanish branch, the legacy took the form of golden solemnity, a kind of sacred gravity that turned governance into ritual. Philip II ruled from the Escorial, a palace monastery carved into the granite hills outside Madrid, its corridors echoing not with laughter or music, but with the click of rosary beads, the rustle of state papers, the soft tread of monks who moved like shadows through its halls. He governed with the same quiet intensity his grandfather had shown in Ghent, but now the weight was heavier, the world wider, the stakes higher. Silver from Potosi flowed into his coffers like a river of liquid moonlight, yet his hands remained calloused from writing late into the night. His ink-stained fingers drafting letters to viceroys in Mexico, cardinals in Rome, and governors in Brussels. He married 4 times, not for love, though affection sometimes grew in the quiet spaces between duty, but to secure peace. To claim a throne, to produce an heir who might carry the name into another generation. Each wife brought a new kingdom closer, each child a new thread in the web. And though his reign would be marked by rebellion in the Netherlands and defeat at sea, the Habsburg presence in Spain endured not through fear, but through the slow, steady accumulation of ritual, faith, and daily presence, until the name itself became part of the landscape, like the olive trees or the sirocco wind. In Vienna, the Austrian branch grew in a different climate, colder, more cautious, shaped by the constant pressure of the Ottoman Empire to the east, whose drums could sometimes be heard on clear nights from the ramparts, and the fractious princes of Germany to the west, who guarded their autonomy like treasure. Here the Habsburgs became less kings and more anchors, holding the center as the world threatened to fly apart in every direction. They learned Turkish not to mock it, but to negotiate with sultans in their own tongue. They mastered German not just to command, but to soothe electors with the familiar cadence of their own dialects. They spoke Czech and Hungarian not as conquerors, but as neighbors, learning folk songs to sing at weddings, remembering the names of local saints to honor at festivals. They filled their courts not with flamboyant artists or swaggering generals, but with diplomats who could listen for an hour without interrupting, scholars who copied treaties in perfect hand, and archivists who understood that memory was a form of power because what is remembered cannot be erased. And they married, always married, sometimes to cousins, sometimes to strangers. Always with the unspoken hope that another union might delay another war, might buy another decade of peace for the valleys their ancestors had once walked with nothing but a staff and a promise. You could see the legacy not in grand monuments alone, but in the quiet details that only those who lived within it would notice. A Spanish ambassador in Prague who spoke with a Viennese accent because his mother had been an Austrian countess. A Bohemian noblewoman who prayed with a Spanish rosary passed down from her grandmother, its beads worn smooth by generations of whispered petitions. A Hungarian count who signed his letters with a Habsburg seal, not out of obligation, but out of habit, as if the name had become part of his own. It was in the way a name, Maria Ferdinand. Charles repeated itself across generations and borders, like a refrain in a song too long to finish in one lifetime, each iteration slightly different, yet unmistakably the same melody. It was in the shared taste for dark velvet in court dress, for solemn polyphonic music in chapel services, for meals eaten in near silence, for the scent of beeswax and old paper that seemed to hang in the air of every Habsburg residence from Brussels to Innsbruck. The Habsburgs were becoming less a family and more a feeling, a presence that lingered in the air of half a continent, like the scent of incense long after the candle is burned low. And yet, for all this expansion, the core remained unchanged, as if the heart of the family had never left the stone nest in the Alps. In Vienna, as in Habichtsburg centuries before, the hearth still burned at night, its warmth a silent promise of continuity. Children were still taught not to boast of their titles, but to mend fences before they were taught to sign treaties. A promise was still worth more than a proclamation, a handshake more binding than a signed charter. The methods had scaled to the size of empires, but the values had not. The web of blood and gold was vast, intricate, spanning oceans and mountain ranges. But it was still woven with the same thread that Radbot and Etta had first spun: steadiness, duty, the quiet belief that to endure was to matter, and that true power lies not in how loudly you speak, but in how faithfully you show up, year after year, generation after generation. You can almost feel it now, the soft tug of that web, how it holds without binding, connects without consuming. It is not the legacy of conquerors, but of keepers, not of fire, but of ember. And in that ember's glow, a dynasty found its true strength, not in how much it owned, but in how deeply it was woven into the fabric of a world that, for a time, learned to breathe more easily because they're not because they demanded peace, but because they lived it, quietly, consistently, without fanfare. They did not shout their values from towers. They baked them into bread, stitched them into letters, carried them in the way they greeted a messenger or consoled a grieving neighbor. And in doing so, they became not just rulers, but a rhythm the slow, steady beat beneath the noise of history. pulse that kept the continent from unraveling completely during centuries of fracture and fire. So as you listen now, imagine that slow weaving, a letter sealed with red wax, its contents known only to two families who will one day become one. Child's hand placed gently in another's at an altar, not because they love each other yet, but because their elders believe they might. Names spoken in two languages at once, not as a compromise, but as a gift. This is how history is shaped, not always by the loudest voice, but by the one that stays, listens, and remains. It's not by the sword that cuts, but by the thread that binds. And the Habsburgs, for all their crowns and conquests, were at their most powerful, not when they ruled the world, when they chose, again and again, to build a home large enough to hold it. And in that home spanning palaces, monasteries, villages, and ships crossing oceans, the light was never blinding, but it was constant, never flashy, but always there. And that, perhaps, is the quietest and most enduring kind of legacy of all.
Years passed, then decades, then centuries, and the world that had once bent around the Habsburg name began to turn without it. Not with a sudden rejection, not with a dramatic overthrow, but with the quiet indifference of time itself, which neither hates nor honors, but simply moves forward, reshaping all it touches until even empires become landscapes. The double-headed eagle, once stitched into banners that fluttered above armies, stamped on coins that passed through 1,000 hands, and carved above palace gates from Madrid to Prague, slowly faded into the background of history, like a mural left too long in the rain, its colors softening, its lines blurring, until it was no longer a symbol of power, but a memory, a whisper in stone, a shape half remembered in dreams. And in that fading, something gentle happened. The Habsburgs ceased to be rulers and became part of the air. The soil, the quiet rhythm of a continent that had absorbed their legacy without even noticing, like a river that carries silt from distant mountains and deposits it gently in new fields, enriching the ground long after the source has been forgotten. In Vienna, the Hofburg Palace stood as it always had, its limestone walls glowing golden in the late afternoon sun, its courtyards still echoing with footsteps, but the voices within had changed. No longer did emperors pace its corridors, weighing the fate of Christendom. No longer did ministers whisper urgent strategies behind closed doors. No longer did children run through its halls with the careless joy of those born to crowns. Now it housed offices, museums, the quiet hum of bureaucracy, and the soft shuffle of tourists moving from room to room with guidebooks in hand, reading summaries that compressed lifetimes into 2 sentences, unaware of the sleepless nights, the whispered prayers, the quiet acts of courage that had once filled those spaces. The same rooms where Maria Theresa had signed decrees to educate every child in her realm, where Franz Joseph had mourned his son and his empress, now held display cases with gloves, snuff boxes, and letters sealed with wax that would never be opened again, because they were unimportant, but because the world had moved on, and the urgency that once gave them weight had dissolved into the quiet dust of archives. The Habsburgs were no longer rulers. They had become part of the architecture itself, as essential and invisible as the mortar between the stones, as the ivy that climbs the walls without asking permission. In Spain, the Escorial remained austere and eternal. its granite bones unmoved by the tides of revolution that swept through the 19th century, its halls still cool even in summer, its silence still deeper than that of a forest at dawn, but the line that Charles V had hoped would endure forever, the Spanish Habsburgs had flickered out long before, extinguished not in battle or betrayal, but in silence, in the hollow coughs of inbred heirs, whose faces grew longer with each generation, whose eyes held the weight of a legacy too heavy to carry, whose bodies seemed to whisper the same truth in every bone, that even the strongest bloodline cannot thrive without new roots. The last of them, Charles II, the Bewitched, died childless in 1700, his body frail, his mind clouded. His final breath as quiet as the turning of a page in an old book, and with him went the dream of a unified Habsburg Spain, not with a bang, but with a sigh, like a candle burning its last drop of wax, leaving behind the scent of smoke and the memory of light, but no flame. And though the Spanish crown passed to new hands, the Habsburg presence remained not in power, but in custom, in the rhythm of fiestas, in the way certain families still crossed themselves at the mention of St. Charles, in the quiet pride of those who traced their lineage back to a time when the sun never set on their king's domains. Meanwhile, the Austrian branch endured longer, adapting, retreating, redefining itself through the upheavals of Napoleon, the rise of nationalism, the slow unraveling of empire in the modern age. They became less monarchs and more symbols, figures of continuity in a world that craved change but feared chaos, anchors in a sea of revolutions. They learned to speak the language of the people, not just the court. They walked among crowds, not above them. They signed constitutions, not just decrees. And when the final blow came in 1918, after the Great War had drained Europe of its old certainties, its old hierarchies, its old faith in order, the last emperor, Charles I, did not rage against fate, did not flee in secret or plot a return. He accepted exile with the same quiet dignity his ancestors had shown when accepting crowns. And he died on a Portuguese island, far from the Alps, far from the stone nest where it had all begun, yet still murmuring prayers in the same faith that had guided Radbot 1,000 years before, his hands folded as if in sleep, as if in surrender, as if in peace. And in that death, the last thread of imperial Habsburg rule was cut not with violence, but with stillness, not with rebellion, but with release. And the world moved on not with malice, not with celebration, but with the quiet efficiency of a river changing course. New flags rose over old cities, new anthems filled the air, new heroes appeared in schoolbooks, and the name Habsburg became a footnote, a curiosity, a costume for historical dramas, a word spoken mostly in museums or by genealogists tracing the threads of forgotten bloodlines. Yet in the quiet places, the village churches of Tourette, where candles still burned before a portrait of Ferdinand, the hidden chapels of Bohemia, where an old woman whispered a Habsburg prayer before bed, The family altars of noble houses long fallen from grace, where a silver locket held a faded miniature of a long-dead archduchess. The memory lingered, not as history, but as habit, not as pride, but as presence. A grandmother would light a candle on All Saints' Day and whisper a name no one else remembered. A farmer would point to a crumbling watchtower on a hill and say, "That was theirs once," his voice neither bitter nor nostalgic, just factual, like noting the change of seasons. A student, leafing through an old book in a university library, would pause at a faded map and feel, for a moment, the weight of a world held together not by war, but by will, and wonder, briefly, what it must have been like to carry such a name. You can almost feel it now, the way time folds over the past like a blanket, not to smother it, but to keep it warm. The eagle is no longer in the sky, but its shadow still falls across courtyards, where pigeons nest in the crevices of imperial coats of arms, where children play without knowing whose hands once signed treaties in those very rooms. The names Radbot, Werner, Charles, Maria, Ferdinand are no longer spoken in council chambers, but they live in archives, in genealogies, in the quiet pride of a family that once held half the world and never raised its voice to do it. The world has forgotten the details, but it has not forgotten the shape they left behind. A Europe stitched together, however briefly, by marriage instead of massacre, by patience instead of panic, by the quiet belief that connection was stronger than division, and that legacy is not built in fire, but in faithfulness. And in the Alps, the wind still moves through the pines the same way it did 1,000 years ago, carrying the same scent of resin and cold stone. The spring at Habichtsburg still runs clear, its water untouched by time, its song unchanged. The ridge still looks out over the same valleys, now crossed by highways and dotted with modern roofs, yet still cradled by the same mountains that watched the first stone be laid, that heard the first promise spoken, that held their breath when Radbot walked the ramparts at dawn and wondered if his name would last beyond his lifetime. Time has gathered around the memory like fog around a lantern, not to hide the light, but to make it softer, gentler, more dreamlike. And in that softness, the Habsburg story becomes not a lesson in power, but a lullaby about endurance. How a name tended with care across generations can outlive crowns, outlast empires, and settle into the soil like a seed that never stops growing, even when no one is watching, even when no one remembers who planted it. So as you listen now, imagine that quiet gathering of time, the slow return of stone to mountain, of name to whisper, of empire to echo. This is not an ending, but a resting, the kind of rest that comes after a long journey, when the pack is set down, the boots are unlaced, and the stars come out one by one, indifferent to who once ruled beneath them. The Habsburgs did not vanish. They dissolved like salt in water, becoming part of the world they once shaped. Their influence no longer visible, but still felt in the borders that curve gently instead of cutting sharply. In the treaties that favor compromise over conquest, in the quiet dignity of those who choose to build rather than break, and in that dissolution they achieved something rarer than immortality. They became ordinary, human, woven into the fabric of daily life so completely that their absence is not a wound, but a whisper. For even eagles must sleep, and even empires become dreams. And dreams, in the end, are the only things that never truly die. They simply wait in the quiet corners of memory for someone to listen again. And if you listen closely now, beneath the sound of your own breath, you might just hear the wind moving through the Alps, carrying a name that no longer rules, but still remains.
Even now, long after the last Habsburg crown was set aside and the final palace fell silent, their presence lingers not in monuments or textbooks, not in grand statues or national anthems, but in the quiet architecture of the world we live in the spaces between the lines of modern life where history breathes softly, almost imperceptibly. You might not notice it at first, because it doesn't shout, it hums. It lives in the borders of modern Europe, not drawn by war alone, but shaped over centuries by marriage, negotiation. An uneasy compromise, a map that reflects not just conquest, but connection. Not just force, but the slow, patient work of people who believed that peace was worth more than glory. It lives in the cobblestone streets of Vienna, where the scent of roasting chestnuts in autumn mingles with the echo of imperial processions that no one alive remembers. Yet the rhythm of the city still carries that old cadence, like a heartbeat beneath the noise of trams and footsteps. It lives in the quiet efficiency of Swiss neutrality. Born in part from the very valleys where Radbot once walked his lands, choosing peace over pride, fairness over force, and in doing so, planted a seed that would one day grow into a national ethos. The Habsburgs did not leave behind an empire scramble, but they left behind a pattern. A way of holding power gently, of weaving connection across difference, the believing that stability was its own kind of greatness, and that pattern is still with us. Woven into the fabric of institutions, treaties, and daily life. And if you listen closely, not with your ears, but with your bones, you might feel it in yourself. Have you ever chosen to mend rather than break? To wait rather than rush? To honor a promise even when no one was watching, even when it cost you something? That is the Habsburg echonaut, the part about crowns or conquests. Not the part about palaces or PayPal blessings, but the quiet, human part. The understanding that true legacy is built not in moments of glory, but in the ordinary hours no one records, in the small choices that seem to change nothing, yet shift everything over time. The Habsburgs' real inheritance is not titles or territories. It's the idea that you can shape the world not by demanding space, but by filling it with care consistently over generations. And that such care, though invisible to historians, ripples outward in ways you may never see, but others will feel for centuries. You can see their shadow in the European Union today, not as a direct heir, not as a reincarnation, but as a distant cousin. Born from the same weary realization that war is easier than trust, but trust is the only thing that lasts. The dream of a continent held together not by armies, but by shared interests, mutual respect. In careful compromise, that dream didn't begin in the 20th century with treaties signed in Brussels or Strasbourg. It began in a stone nest in the Alps, with a man who married his son to a neighbor's daughter so their children wouldn't have to fight over a stream. With a woman who wrote letters to another woman across a valley, sharing remedies for winter coughs and recipes for bread. And though that dream has frayed and faltered, been tested by crisis and doubt, it endures, because someone once believed, even quietly, even imperfectly, that connection was stronger than division, and that belief once planted is hard to uproot. In your own life, you may have felt this tough the weight of a name, the pull of a family story, the quiet pressure of expectations you didn't choose but carry anyway. Perhaps you've inherited a tradition, a recipe, a way of speaking, a silence that means something specific in your home. The Habsburgs knew that feeling well they were never entirely free. They were always answering to the past, preparing for the future, living in the narrow space between what was and what must be. And yet, within that constraint, they found meaning, not in changing the world overnight, but in tending their corner of it with such steady hands that the world bent around them slowly, gratefully. And in that steadiness, they discovered that freedom is not the absence of responsibility, but the presence of purpose, and that purpose can be as quiet as a hand placed on a child's forehead at night, as simple as a letter sealed with care, as ordinary as bread shared across a table with someone you once called a stranger. So as you rest here now, in the warmth of your own room, under the same stars that watched Radbot walk his ramparts and Charles V stare into the night from his monastery window, ask yourself softly, without urgency, without expectation, what am I weaving, even now, without realizing it? What small choices kindness is offered without reward, promises kept in private. Bridges built when no one was watching might one day become part of someone else's foundation. You don't need to answer. Just let the question float, like a leaf on a slow-moving river, or a breath released into the dark. Because history is not just what happened long ago in distant lands. It is what lives in the spaces between us, and the way we speak to strangers, the way we honor our word, the way we choose, again and again, to build rather than break, even when it's hard, even when no one sees. And in that sense, the Habsburg story never ended. It simply passed into other hands, into your hands. You may never wear a crown or sign a treaty, but you carry the same quiet power they once did. The power to choose connection over isolation, patience over reaction, presence over performance. And in a world that so often rewards noise, speed, and spectacle, that choice is revolutionary. It is an act of quiet courage that echoes not in headlines, but in hearts, and in time. Those echoes shape the world more surely than any decree ever could. Think of the people who have shaped your life, not the famous ones, but the quiet ones. The grandparent who taught you to garden. The teacher who saw something in you before you saw it yourself. The friend who stayed when others left. They did not seek to change history, but they changed yours, and in doing so, they became part of a lineage of care that stretches back through Radbot and Ida. Through Charles and Philip, through nameless women who wrote letters and nameless men who mended fences, all the way to you. You are not separate from this story, you are, its next verse, written not in ink, but in action, not in stone, but in breath. And perhaps in the quiet of this night, as you let your breath slow and your thoughts soften, you are already part of its next chapter, not as a ruler, not as a hero, but as a keeper of the quiet things that hold the world together. The Habsburgs did not save Europe with swords. They helped hold it together with consistency, with presence, with the daily practice of showing up. And you, in your own life, in your own way, can do the same, not for fame, not for legacy, but because it is the right thing to do, and because the world needs people who remember that even the smallest thread, when woven with care, can help hold a continent. So let this thought be your companion as you drift towards sleep. You are part of a long, quiet river of human care that flows beneath the noise of history, unseen but essential. Though your name may never be carved in marble, it will be felt in the lives you touch, the peace you choose, in the quiet courage of your everyday choices. That is the truest kind of immortality, not the kind that shouts, but the kind that lingers. Like the scent of rain on dry earth, like the echo of a lullaby sung long ago, but still remembered in the bones. And as you close your eyes, know that you are not alone. You are part of a story that began in the mist of the Alps and continues in the quiet corners of the present. Carried forward not by emperors, but by ordinary people who choose again and again to be kind, to be steady, to be there. And in that choice, the Habsburgs live not as kings, but as a whisper in your breath, a warmth in your hands, a light in your heart that needs no crown to shine. And so, dear listener, as our quiet journey through the rise of the Habsburgs comes gently to a close, I invite you to let the story settle into your bones like snow on a still hillside, soft, seamless, and without weight. You've walked with us through misty Alpine valleys, through candlelit chambers where marriages were made like promises whispered to the future, through the steady courage of men and women who held empires not with clenched fists, but with open hands. And now it's time to rest, not because the story is over, but because you've earned this stillness. Thank you for lending your attention, your breath, your quiet presence to this tale. In a world that so often demands noise, speed, and certainty, choosing to listen to a story told slowly, gently, is itself a kind of quiet rebellion, mentality. And in that choice, you've honored not just history, but your own deep need for peace. As you drift now towards sleep, know that you carry with you a thread of that ancient web woven from patience, from presence, from the belief that small, steady things can outlast even the grandest crowns. Let that thought be your pillow. Let the echo of mountain winds and monastery bells be your lullaby. If you'd like, before you close your eyes completely, you can leave a quiet word in your heart, a name, a place, a feeling. Perhaps you're listening from a city lit by streetlights, or from a village wrapped in darkness. Wherever you are, you're not alone. Somewhere under the same sky, another soul is also letting go, also dreaming of stone nests and silent promises. And if this story stayed with you, if it soothed you, if it made you feel, even for a moment, that you belong to something older and deeper than the present hour, know that there will be other nights, other tales waiting for you here. No rush, no schedule, just a soft voice, a quiet path, and history told like a lullaby. So now, let your breath slow even more. Let your thoughts soften like ink in water. Let the weight of the day fall away as gently as a leaf returning to the earth. Sleep well, dear traveler. Sleep beneath the shadow of the double eagle, not as a symbol of power, but as a reminder that even the mightiest legacies begin with a single breath. It's a single choice. It's a single night like this one. Good night.